One of the big mega trends in the utility industry today undoubtedly is undergrounding. Some utilities have really embraced it, like PG&E, as a possible way to mitigate fire risk. Others, like SCE and Florida Power and Light, have taken a selective approach, using undergrounding in particularly high-risk areas, but using other solutions that are cheaper and might be just as safe, like covered conductor. Most people don't know that those high wires at the top of your poles are typically bare wires. Well, SCE is turning a lot of them into insulated wires to minimize fire risk. They're putting up composite poles and so forth. In some areas, like a neighborhood where I live, the residents passed a ballot initiative to pay for undergrounding themselves to increase reliability and resiliency and improve the aesthetics of the area. But we all assessed ourselves $32,000 to underground. So it's not a cheap proposition by any means. As somebody who spent a lot of his career responsible for over 100,000 miles of distribution lines, I know that this is not an easy question, because undergrounding local distribution lines is much more expensive than people realize. You heard Mayor Bass say, one question is who's going to pay for it? PG&E has multiple estimates now, and the average cost for undergrounding across their system is $3.5 million a mile. And they've told me that some difficult areas will be $8 or $10 million a mile to underground, right? So it is not cheap. And the disruption of having your streets torn up to underground is difficult for the residents as well. Thank you. In underground utilities, people, you're going to hear from our speakers, often don't realize that they have a lower frequency of outage, but a much higher duration when you do have an outage, because you don't know where the wire failed. It's very easy with overhead. You look and go right there. Underground, you have a large span. Kristen, what's an average span now that we run between handholds or vaults?
Depends upon a couple hundred feet, 300,
so
400 feet.
300-400 feet, yeah. And somewhere in there something went wrong. And you might have to tear the street up to find it, right? So there are pluses and minuses to all this. And there's been some talk in the fire areas about even undergrounding the big wires that you see on the lattice towers along the freeways, transmission. And people have no idea how expensive that is. So I pulled out a figure. Edison had to underground 3 miles of 500 kV, that's 500,000 volt transmission in an area called Chino Hills. And when I took the Public Utility Commission's published figures for how much it cost, which look low to me, to be honest with you, but I took their published figure and I divided by the distance, and undergrounding that transmission line cost $14,000 a foot, according to their metrics. So, you know, this is difficult stuff. And our panel today, all experts, are going to help us understand better some of the pluses, minuses, and alternatives as well. So I'm going to quickly introduce them, no particular order. Jason Hills is Manager of Transmission and Distribution Engineering for LA Department of Water and Power. Tom Pilarski, immediately next to Jason, is Geospatial Solutions Lead for Guida Incorporated, that does incredibly high-tech surveying and mapping of, especially of underground subsurface stuff. Next to Tom is Kristen Barbee. She is a real doll. That's where my kids always jump in and say, "Dad, your jokes are so lame," right? and Kristen is Principal Manager of Edison. She, by the way, interesting thing, she's been doing this 22 years, but she was responsible for overseeing the Eaton Fire electrical restoration response with over 130 crews working on restoring power in the Eaton Canyon area. And then finally, last but not least, Tim Hade, who's COO and co-founder of Scale Microgrids Solutions, who's going to give us a bit of a different perspective on some ways that we can be more resilient, particularly if the utility has to shut off your power in order to try to protect you. Have any of you had a public service power shut off at your homes? They don't get used often, right? They don't get used often. Yeah, and I had many of them. So we're going to hear all those different perspectives on this issue. So in no particular order, you want to kick us off, Jason?
Sure.
Give us some comments.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for inviting me here. And I'm actually, in addition to being here to share some information from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, I'm also excited to learn from the co-panelists over here. Even in the pre-talk, I've already learned a lot from Tom and got his cards, so I'm looking forward to using that. But Jim mentioned a lot of things that I did want to point out with regards to our perspective over at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So as Jim mentioned, there are many areas that are more challenging to convert to underground, and actually the city of Los Angeles is basically not a rural area, so the entire area is challenging. We've got lots of utilities that we're competing for right-of-way space for. We have certain water table issues where a lot of the vaults can get flooded, and then it could be really hard to detect where the faults are. Additionally, we have the old 4.8 kV system that's delta ungrounded, so that even makes it even harder for us to detect where our faults are. So in addition to having to pump out all the water, open up vaults, look at them, we have to, also, we have a longer span of circuits that we have to go through in order to identify the fault. And we also sometimes have to look at multiple circuits to find the fault. Not just, it's not easily identified which circuit the fault is at times. So, so there is a big trade-off with regards to safety, the frequency of outages versus the duration of outages, SAIDI. That's something that we always factor in when we consider undergrounding. Of course, we do see undergrounding as a major tool for improving reliability in areas where there's high frequency of outages, and also whenever there's risks involved, such as the high fire threat areas. But there's many considerations. There's dozens and dozens or even hundreds of data points that we have to factor in when we make those decisions. And then, of course, we can't ignore the fact that there's a cost issue. So for us, when we have to do something such as relocating other utilities, let's say it's sewers or high-pressure gas lines, that can also add a lot to the cost of converting to underground for us. So. But we are looking forward to learning from many of the other efforts and the industry partners, and seeing what we could do to make it a more cost-effective method of improving reliability, safety, and reducing risk. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the others have to say.
Thank you, Jason. Just a little aside, I mentioned that I have a home in a neighborhood where the residents decided to pay for undergrounding, but it has a high water table, Jason mentioned. So I've watched the crews. I supervised a lot of crews in my life, and I would go out and talk to the crews. A lot of them know me, and they were putting a vault in, underground vault, which you expect when you have these underground systems. And they had perforated pipes running everywhere with a big pump and a water treatment facility next to it. And they said, in order to put this vault in, we have to keep the hole free of water, and we're pumping 1,000 gallons a minute through a water treatment plant and back out into the ocean in order to keep the hole dry. Can you imagine the difficulty and the cost of just that? That's for one vault. They had 32 they had to put underground. So interesting stuff. Tom.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Somewhat as a surveyor, wondering why I'm here. But some of the challenges that I see come from the mapping of utilities. When we take a look at our current state of our as-builts right now, whether it be from telecom, electrical, or whatnot, they're very substandard. So when Jason and Kristen talk about undergrounding their utilities, they're talking from a cost and a magnitude. And when I look at it, I'm looking at it from an engineering and planning type, or from a surveyor's type, where I'm going to be putting these things in the ground and giving them a corridor to put them in. And when I take a look at the state of as-built right now, it's pretty poor. And trying to give them a corridor without the proper technology is pretty bad. So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to create digital twinning of the underground and the above ground. We've teamed with the Japanese firm GeoSearch in order to map underground utilities in 3 dimensions, so that when Jason and Kristen go to underground their utilities, they can go ahead and put into CAD the dimensions that they need between all the utilities and get clearances and see if it's even possible.
Tom,
You know.
briefly touch on the technology, because
Yeah.
people don't know how you do that.
Yeah.
They don't dig it all up and draw it.
No, it's non-destructive. So what we do is we take the as-built, we look at them, we analyze them, and then what we do is we take ground penetrating radar, and the Japanese technology that we're looking at allows us to do it at highway speeds. So we can go down, we did a test project on Century Boulevard as we went into LAX. Some of you may know, getting any type of traffic control in LAX, it's not going to happen. You're not going to block traffic going into one of the busiest airports in the world. So when you have technology that allows you to go 40, 50 miles an hour and collect utilities, it's a game changer. So what we're doing is we're taking these utilities and now we're building a 3-dimensional map based on ground penetrating radar. And when we have that data and now we can hand it over to the engineering teams at LADWP or Edison or PG&E or whatnot, we can give them these more accurate maps and then marry it with the as-builts to show, okay, here is what we were able to find, here's what we're not able to find, and they're undefined. We're not saying they don't exist, we're just saying we can't find any evidence that it's there. So now we can have this full picture of what's going on underground and marry it with the above ground, so that when they go into designing this stuff, they have a better picture of what's going on. So now the expense basically is on undergrounding the utility. It's not looking at conflicts, because I can tell you from the engineering and survey side, the number one expense that we see is when they get their plans right and then we go to build it and there's a water line crossing right where they didn't know a water line was. Because now it's not just, oh, we'll just go under it. No, it's like somewhat of a full redesign, because, okay, you can't put water next to electric. So you got to really take a look and you got to put in the parameters. And now not only are you losing money because you have to go to redesign, now you have time. And now you got the street all tore up, you're going to redesign, and now if you're stopping work for 2-3 weeks, okay, that's time and money. And you think that contractor's going to go, oh yeah, just call me back when you're ready? No, it's RFI. I said that I'd be here. That's your problem. Pay me. So now those expenses for the undergrounding double, triple, because of something that we could have done on the front end by proper mapping. So when I look at the biggest challenges, it's where we are in our current state of as-builting and the current state of mapping of utilities. And we need to get better at that so that I can help Edison, help LADWP, to concentrate on getting the funds to just put it in the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I will add an interesting anecdote. Tomita-san, the Japanese inventor who came up with this high-speed ground penetrating radar and 3D imaging, actually he's been at Verde in the past. And he actually didn't invent this to find utilities. He invented it as a humanitarian thing on his own nickel to find landmines that are still in the ground in Southeast Asia, blowing kids' legs off. Every day this happens. And so he developed a technology where he could detect the landmines so they could be safely disarmed and protect kids. And then he figured out he could also use it for utilities. So very cool story. Thanks, Tom. Kristen.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. So I represent distribution for Edison. And undergrounding, or targeted undergrounding, has been a part of our annual portfolio for the last couple years. In 2017, when we started part of our wildfire mitigation and risk mitigation, like Jen mentioned, covered conductor has been installed all across the territory. It continues to be installed across the territory, and it is our standard for any new overhead construction standard, no matter if you're in a high fire risk area or not. covered conductor is the standard on our distribution systems. Like I mentioned, the last couple years, part of our infrastructure replacements and things we do through our general rate case processes, targeted underground, or TUG as we call it, has been a component. And in fact, unique to the Malibu area as well as the Altadena area, we've had on-the-shelf designs in place, something close to about 10 miles on the Palisades side, and we had just over a mile on the Altadena side when the latest fires have broken out. Part of the complexity, of course, of undergrounding is we have joint utility coordination, we have environmental, certainly ground disturbing activities involving underground installation of our utilities are much more impactful to environmental areas than just the ground disturbance of pole installations. And so those projects typically are delayed many, many years to get installed and to get the approvals to execute. And so these recent wildfires and of course the executive orders to lessen some of the permitting requirements have certainly put some of that work in full speed ahead type mode. And you know, if you're in the Palisades area, you will see lots of active construction going on along PCH and Topanga and other areas. And then on the Altadena side, one of the targeted underground projects has already been brought forward. It was actually an approved project to be executed in 2026, and part of that project has already been executed. Just over a mile of that underground infrastructure has already been installed. And we pulled that project ahead because all the overhead infrastructure in that area has been burned. Most of the homes that were served from that particular section of line, with the exception of maybe 2 to 3 homes, only stand. And that infrastructure has already been installed. And so where it makes sense, we are currently in flight for that underground work to certainly replace some of the overhead infrastructure that we would have otherwise just automatically replaced in a fire situation. One other very unique response, and Jim mentioned I oversaw 130 crews. We did solicit, and that's just on the Eaton side. That wasn't even the Palisades side of the fire response that Edison had. We did bring in PG&E for mutual assistance on this effort, which isn't overly common. We often go to Florida and do mutual assistance, but we did bring in extra crews. One pause we took, so most of the times on a fire, we just replace exactly what was there. In this case, one of our control rooms for our substations burned down as well. It was a 4 kV substation system, which essentially, you know, like you mentioned, we've determined most of that antiquated. It doesn't provide like much lengthy reliability future for us long term. And so in the probably 2 weeks following the wildfire rebuild efforts on the Eaton side, we actually converted all those circuits to a 16 kV system and completely deemed the substation unnecessary, and we cut over the entire substation on the fly. Very unusual again. The downside is because all of our systems are intertied, our circuits are intertied for reliability, most of that work, of course, was all installed as quickly as possible and overhead. We did make decisions to pause, primarily on the Malibu side, to say where can we not rebuild overhead and start making those decisions to bring in the underground. So we will have, there's areas right now we rebuilt nothing intentionally as we go through the exercise to determine what is feasible. Right now on the Eaton side, we have approximately 40 miles in flight, 8 actively being designed, about 1.5 miles to 2 miles currently under construction. And on the Palisades side, they've prioritized 90 miles of underground, with 10 we're probably already in design, and they'll just continue to work. It's years of work to do this kind of scope. So we continue to bring forward what we can, prioritize those homes that need it when customers ready for power that we'll be able to serve. So the lots of agency coordination as well that goes into that.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Thanks. I know you had a lot of sleepless nights already. Believe me, she's missed her family a lot through this, and we appreciate what you've done. Now imagine PG&E has requested the Public Utilities Commission to allow them, because they have a heavily forested area, as you know, a lot of PG&E, to underground 10,000 miles of distribution lines at $3.5 million a mile average cost. That's $35 billion that California ratepayers would have to pay. And we have some of the highest rates in the continental US right now. So this is a burden. Nothing's free, right? Now, a whole different view. I had a great chat with him on the phone. Tim is a character, and he's smart as a whip on top of that. So Tim, tell us a little bit about what you're thinking.
Yeah, so I run a microgrid company, and I was asked to speak about undergrounding. And I'm actually a really big fan of undergrounding, but I think in order to explain why, I gotta sort of explain the context of this. So I think to talk about undergrounding, you first have to talk about morale, right? And I think one of the big problems we have in Southern California right now is morale in the electricity system is not great. So when you go to most meetings today, post sort of the LA fires, the vibes aren't great. And we should fix that, right? Because one of the things we should remember is this is California, and we built the most important electricity system in the history of the world. That's not hyperbole, right? So when I went to COP 2 years ago, I met a lady from Australia. I told her I was from California. She gave me a hug. I asked her why she gave me a hug, and she said, well, the only reason humanity has a chance at conquering the climate crisis is because we have solar, wind, electric vehicles, and batteries, and all four of those things were invented and commercialized in California. And by the way, one of the things we're going to talk about in the context of undergrounding is affordability. One of the reasons that electricity isn't affordable in California is because we pay a leadership tax for the last 50 years of work that we've done to help humanity solve the climate crisis, and no one's going to come rescue us from that, but it's a point that I like to make. So look, undergrounding, right? The typical conversation I have with people about undergrounding is they call me up and they say, Tim, what do you think about undergrounding? And I say, it's like asking me, what do you think about a hammer, right? What's the job that you're trying to do, right? Undergrounding is a tool, and it only matters in the context of the job that you're trying to accomplish. And I say, what's the job you're trying to accomplish? And they say, well, we want to have safe, affordable, reliable power for everyone in California before the Olympics in 2028. And then I start laughing, right? And I say, well, I really want to be the point guard for the Lakers, but I like to focus my time on things that are realistic. I mean, think about this for a second, right? Safe, affordable, reliable power, right? That's, people sort of take that for granted. But today in California, electricity isn't affordable, right? That's just a fact. We have the highest electric rates in the continental United States. 20% of California ratepayers are behind on their electricity bills, which, by the way, sounds really bad. And I looked that up, and it turns out we're like middle of the pack. So in Mississippi, 35% of people can't afford their electricity bills. So that's not unique to California, but we're leaders, and we should do better than that, right? And so the problem with affordability is we have the highest electric rates in the continental United States. 20% of the people are behind on their electricity bills. That means when we think about the levers that we have to make our electricity system safer and more reliable, we can't raise rates, right? And that creates a problem. So then we have safety and reliability, and there's a trade-off between those two things. Safety is something that's really hard for me to think about, right? Because it's a subjective criteria. What I can tell you is that this January, when I was talking to my neighbors about how safe they felt when the wind was blowing and it hadn't rained in 6 months, not a lot of people felt safe. So I don't think there's a lot of public momentum to mess around with grid safety, right? If anything, we have to make the grid a lot more safer, not less safe. So we can't raise rates, and we can't make the grid less safe, and that leaves reliability. And so look, I think the first thing that has to happen in the context of this undergrounding conversation is we need to lower the thresholds for public safety power shutoffs. The only thing that we're doing in the state of California that we know stops wildfires is turning the grid off, and we don't turn the grid off enough. I think one of the conversations that we need to be having is, why is that the utility's responsibility to make the decision, right? People don't think about this enough, but when we're asking utilities and grid operators to make the decision about turning the power off, we're putting them in an impossible situation, right? You're basically giving the people the choice between definitely killing 10 people or maybe killing 80 people, right? That's kind of what the math comes down to. And the fact that we don't have an independent entity like CAL FIRE or some sort of independent, entity that's making that decision, it doesn't make any sense. But then we get into, okay, once public safety power shutoffs are taken care of, what are the tools that utilities have at their disposal? And basically, when you think about how to make the grid more reliable under these circumstances, you have two kinds of tools. You have grid enhancing technologies, like a lot of what we've talked about so far, And then you have non-wires alternatives, which are things like microgrids and distributed energy resources. And the fundamental problem that we have in California is that utilities are only allowed to use one of those tools, right? And so we passed laws to deregulate the electricity sector in 1995 that no longer make sense, right? But what those laws say is that utilities are not allowed to invest in generation. So they're not allowed to invest in solar panels or batteries or behind the meter resources or things like that. And so, like, ultimately the answer for undergrounding is sometimes in some places, right? It makes sense. The problem is utilities, who are the only entities in the state of California that have the scale and the capabilities to really do this fast enough, can only use one of those tools. And so I think the second fundamental thing the state of California needs to change is we just need to let the utilities do that. And people say, well, how do you do that? Well, a few years ago, I-95 in Pennsylvania collapsed, right? And what the governor did is he said, this is an emergency, there are no longer any rules, fix I-95, and they fixed I-95 in like 10 days, right? I don't understand why we don't do that in California, right? I don't understand why the governor doesn't say, this is an emergency, SE is allowed to do whatever they need to do in order to make the grid safer, more reliable, and more affordable before the Olympics. I think if we did that, what you would end up with is a system where there's a little bit of undergrounding, a lot of distributed energy resources being deployed, but the outcome of that would be safer, more affordable, more reliable power. And again, I think ultimately that's a legislative and regulatory thing that we have to take care of before any of this good stuff can happen.
I told you he was provocative, didn't I? Yeah. No, I didn't want to get off the phone with him because he made me think. Imagine utilities who aren't being given the tools that they know how to use to help your problems because the law doesn't let them use those tools. Interesting conundrum, right? Now, we've got a little bit of time left, and I want questions from all of you. I've got a few, but I'd rather hear from you. So jump in. Who's got any questions about undergrounding? Don't be shy. Yes?
Well, I'm stressing from a pragmatic one. So, as I listen to the comments, there's kind of a common theme that says, this is what we think it's going to cost, and then we show up, and this is what it really costs. So, in that context, do you have a rule of thumb, or, I'm an engineer myself, so, these kind of rules of thumbs are useful. Do you have a rule of thumb at this point in time that when you sit down around the table and say, we think it's going to cost X, this is our engineering projection, and then this is how much it would be in reality cost, is that 2X?
And remember that it's very influenced by both the topology of the grid, more than both, three things, topology, by geology, what have you got to bore through, right? I mean, there are people whose houses are built on granite boulders, right? And the disruption that's required to get it done. If there's only one road in and out of your community and it has to be shut for 6 weeks, you got a problem, right? Hence, you get different estimates, but I'd like to hear from both Jason and Kristen. What are you guys using as a rule of thumb? They'll be different, I betcha.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll go first. I mean, it varies so much that we really have to look at it case by case. Another thing about our territory that's makes it more complex is like you only want to go in there once and not come back for a really long time. So, if we're going to underground, then we want to do it for the long run. We want to add additional conduits, which also will, result in additional costs. So there's additional factors like that that we need to take into account for, especially given the fact that we have things like electrification. Now, we really have to plan ahead. So, it varies so much for us. It's case by case. I guess what I'd say is it's really more like somewhere between like 5 to 10 times the cost of overhead system.
So I'm going to pin you now. In dollars per mile, what's the range you would think?
Dollars per mile. I mean, yeah, it really, really varies.
This is being recorded.
I'm
pinning me. Well, I'm going to make it a wide range here. I'm going to make it a wide range. Let's go with like 4 to 11.
4 to 11 million. Okay. Kristen, how about your end?
I would say it's very close, and I think because Edison is actively doing underground projects because of the wildfire restoration. It's really where you can do it in a more affordable fashion, then we're trying to offset that, like a peanut butter spread. Right now, I'll give some kind of real life what's happening. We're running, I would say, 1.7 million just on civil costs per mile on the Altadena side, and it's probably 6 to 7 million on the Malibu side. Complexity is 100% a component of that, the amount of vaults that have to go in on the Malibu side, Caltrans complications, hours of work complications. There's so many factors, and so where we can be prudent with those choices is really how we go about doing it. That doesn't necessarily include the electrical labor costs yet. And so it really gets back to exactly what Jim was saying, that 3.5 to 8 million is really what we are forecasting at this cost, that we're going to be ahead for the 130 mile scope that we've already got identified as our priority. That's the range of the costs. And I'll just mention this, and this is maybe unique to Edison, but it's very common. So there's also like labor agreements. So we have represented workforces for our civil teams, those kinds of things. It certainly does have an escalated labor cost, but that's something that we have gone into partnership with our union partners. And so that's one factor when it comes to joint utility trenching. Certainly they can share a cost of those trenches and the underground infrastructure, but they don't necessarily have those same arrangements with a labor workforce. And so it does escalate the cost for other utilities as well, just as another factor of complication and escalations of the cost.
Years ago, I helped a utility after I retired from Edison underground about 300 yards of distribution line, cost $30 million. How could that be? Well, it happened to be distribution that ran right under Times Square. Can you imagine the difficulty in doing that? Yeah. What else? Folks, questions? If you don't have any, I'm going to jump in, but give you first choice. Well, let me ask you a hard policy question, panel, that Tim won't dodge, the rest of you might have to. But I was asked this last week by somebody. Said, is it fair to ask all ratepayers to pay to underground lines in high fire risk areas when those people chose to buy in a low fire risk area and they don't get the benefits of undergrounding? Is it fair that all ratepayers pay to underground when people bought homes at the wilderness interface? So Tim, what do you think? He's got no skin in this game.
No, I don't. Look, I guess my question would be like, define fair, right? I mean, none of this is fair, right? What happened to people in the Palisades, what happened to people in Altadena, that's not fair, right? The fact that all of us in the state of California spent the last 4 years on working on programs that were private sector led and federal government enabled, and then the federal government pulled the rug out from under us, that's not fair. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what's fair. I think what we should be able to do for citizens of California is to go in and say, look, climate change is a real thing. It's providing reliable, affordable, safe electricity a lot harder than it was. But don't worry, we're bringing the best available technology to boot, and we're going to bring the best people and the best technology as quickly as we possibly can and as affordably as we possibly can to serve you and your business and your home. And I think, look, the fundamental problem right now is people don't think that's happening, right? And so, the problem with PG&E and a lot of the, undergrounding that PG&E is doing up north is not that they're doing a bad job with undergrounding, it's that they didn't adequately look at alternatives, right? So if you're spending $10 billion to run a line to a village that you can take off the grid for $1 billion, then people have questions, right? And again, when you say to them, well, look, I understand that we're doing this for 10x the cost of an alternative, but like we're legally not allowed to do the cheaper alternative, then people get pissed off, right? And so I think ultimately, like, the only thing that we can do is we can make sure that the service providers, which are the utilities, have all the tools available to make the best decision for every single ratepayer. And as long as they're doing that, then we're doing everything we can. I think the challenge that a lot of ratepayers have is they don't feel like we're doing everything we can possibly do.
Yeah. Kristen and Jason, I'm going to pin you down. How long, people ask me this all the time, how long does it typically take to convert a neighborhood, a typical neighborhood, from overhead to underground?
You're being recorded.
Of course. I don't even know if I can answer this from a neighborhood perspective. It takes about a month with an expedited process to install the underground infrastructure for 1 mile. That's not the electrical work. The electrical work is probably equal amount of work when it comes to all the makeup of the cable conductors transformation that has to happen. So if you can, magnify that out to the 130 miles we have projected at minimum probably 2 months for that.
Per mile.
Per mile. So it is quite lengthy, and that doesn't even touch on, in both of these fires, and I think very different. We certainly have reached out to Maui and other, experiences, so we can learn from what do we do in these cases on how we respond for our customers. But we have homes that the entire community is burned, and there's one home standing. And that homeowner now needs to make a decision on how they're going to convert their panel to be served from our underground infrastructure. That time frame doesn't even include that to actually get those customers to connect.
A decade or 2 decade long process to do mass conversion. That's what you just heard. People don't realize that sometimes, and they need to have that in mind. Do you agree with Kristen?
Yeah, actually, that was the point that I was going to make, is that dependency on the customer, especially like DWP on our end. The conduit system and the the private property is the responsibility of the customer. So we depend on them installing the underground system that feeds their panel, which will need entry to their panel through underground. So really, I mean, I can't even answer the question of how long it would take.
Now, remember what Jason just said. If that wasn't clear, if you're served by an overhead line coming in, you have that thing called a weatherhead up on your house, and the wire comes in, that means that DWP or Edison or any other utility will bring conduit to your property line. You've got to convert on your property to go down and out from your meter to that point of interconnection at the property line. That's on your nickel. Right? And we're finding out in my neighborhood a lot of very angry people that are being told that's going to be $7,000 to $10,000 because they have to cut their driveway, cut their walkways, cut their patio, right? And that's an additional time and expense. So it's an interesting dilemma. And we are about out of time, aren't we? So this has been fantastic. Anybody have a real quick question? If not, quick one.
Real quick question. I'm in a landslide area, which you know very well. And the notifications from Edison took 3 days notice on a holiday weekend. I do recommend that Edison improves its communication with its clients one heck of a lot more. We can't tell whether you're going to re-energize, where you're going to re-energize, whether you're going to put a microgrid in. You take out a whole community with very little notice. The gas companies know better, incidentally. I would ask you to improve your communication with your customers.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. Well, folks, I wish we had a lot more time, but thank you so much for your attention. Would you join me in thanking our panel?